Okay, time for part 3. It's the Atari Games era, and, well, there's plenty more good arcade games to look at. For all the chaos and confusion that surrounded Atari as a whole at this time, the coin-op division was the one that would largely continue to power through. Not to say that they weren't affected at all, but the titles that we're going to be seeing are largely ones that were created and programmed by people who we are already quite familiar with. People like Ed Logg, Dave Tour, Norm Avalar, Mark Turney, Dave Ralston and John Sowitz, all guys who'd been with Atari for quite a while, and there'll be a few new names cropping up here and there. Once again, there's a lot of classics to look at. The video's chock full of goodness all the way through, and we should start getting into it. However, there's a bit of business to get into first, the switch itself from what was Atari Inc. to Atari Games. And so we head over to July 1984. As it goes, despite the name change, this switch for what was Atari's coin-op division was actually significantly less traumatic than it was for the other parts of the company, the console and computer divisions. They would, for a time, still have the same masters. A lot of the bloodletting had already occurred. There'd been a couple of rounds of big layoffs in the company as a whole, with around half of Atari's existing workforce affected by the brutal restructuring, and the coin-op division certainly hadn't escaped that. A whole lot of outposts around the world, research labs, development units and so on, basically no longer existed by the time we reached the summer. A whole load of announced games failed to materialise, not to mention consoles, such as GCC's Atari 7800 Pro system, something that was shown off in May and was initially supposed to come out in July of 1984. Yeah, that didn't happen. Up in the boardroom, Warner were pretty eager to break the company into pieces, and they entered negotiations with several companies for such a purpose. Philips being perhaps the most notable one, who nearly agreed to purchase half of Atari from Warner. Still, it didn't take long to find an eager buyer, someone who'd recently been forced out of the company he'd created and, after around 5 minutes spent twiddling his thumbs in faux retirement, was eager to get back to the table. That man is, of course, the legendary Jack Tramiel, the old warhorse who built Commodore, made computers for the masses and not the classes, had the sort of miserable relationship with distributors that old Atari could only stand back and admire, mastered the Jack Attack, and treated business as if it was war, with competition against the likes of Texas Instruments fueled by grudges that never faded. On July 2nd, it's announced that Tramiel's new company, Tramiel Technology, named after the frequent misspelling of Jack's surname, have acquired the home computer and video game businesses of Atari. CEO James J. Morgan gets quickly booted back to Philip Morris, where he later tells the press that cigarettes are no more addictive than gummy bears, and if those Atari businesses thought the bloodletting was bad in the final months of Warner, they ain't seen nothing yet. For more on the Tramiel years, the Atari ST and all of that, I refer you back to the Last Stand of Jack Tramiel video that I posted years ago now. It's a goodie. As for the Atari coin-op division, well, for now they're still a part of Warner. They're the part of Atari that Warner wanted to keep, at least for the time being, as it performed better than the home divisions. John Farrand, a Warner executive, becomes Atari's latest CEO, and on July 11th the Atari Inc. name is officially retired. The Warner-led Atari becomes Atari Games, while the Tramiel-led Atari becomes the Atari Corporation. And through all this we still get a bunch more downsizing. Atari Tel, the company's telephone products division, is sold off to an American wing of Mitsubishi, and further layoffs hit the coin-op division, alongside some familiar names leaving at this stage, such as Crystal Castle's designer Franz Lanzinger, and the great Owen Rubin of Major Havoc, Paul Shark and many more. The coin-op division shrinks, with around 150 employees left come August. It is a significantly smaller operation, but it still exists, it's making games, and it's September when the first title arrives under the new setup. Obviously it's a title that was already being worked on at the time the split happened, and it's a pretty big name. Return of the Jedi. Originally, Return of the Jedi was supposed to be another vector game, but designer Dennis Harper wanted people to be able to see the vehicles they were controlling, and for there to be a notable difference in the environments, the game taking place on land as well as in space. And so it became an isometric action title, using Lyle Rains's Pixie board, the anti-aliasing hardware that was originally going to feature in the cancelled ET arcade game. The game isn't quite as memorable as the original Star Wars, but it's still solid and features a similar gameplay loop. Most people have a fairly reasonable chance of being able to blow up the Death Star on their first go-around, using a speeder to fly through the forests of Endor and triggering traps for the stormtroopers, before Lando takes the Falcon down the tunnels to get to the Death Star's core. And it's on the second loop where you then get the other stages. Chewbacca in an AT-ST taking out the shield generator, and the Rebels up in space battling the Star Destroyer. And yes, this was the second Star Wars arcade, despite being based on the third movie. We'll get to The Empire Strikes Back in a little while. Another amusing detail about the game's development comes from an interview Harper did with Craig Granell for Retro Gamer. Lucasfilm were naturally very protective of their movie, and the script that they gave Harper to work with included a fake ending that was completely nonsensical. Happily, Harper figured that this ending was purposefully stupid, and he didn't include it in the game. Perhaps unsurprisingly, considering the time, Jedi didn't come close to the original Star Wars arcade, shifting around 800 units. Personally though, I still enjoy this one a fair bit.
Go for the power regulator on the not power.
Mark Cerny's name has popped up a couple of times here and there, doing little things like a Game of Life inspired algorithm for Millipede and what have you, but now we have his first full arcade game, and it is, of course, Marble Madness from December 1984. The first released game to use Atari's new 16-bit Motorola 68010 based System 1 hardware, this is another fantastic trackball based title where you guide the marble carefully yet quickly through several stages, avoiding various familiar hazards such as rival black marbles, acid pools, or slinkies that look to envelop you, not to mention the various movement based challenges, jumps, narrow passages and the like that you'll have to get through without falling off. Originally starting off as a mini-golf based game, it was gradually stripped down to becoming this abstract marble one where even the marble itself was somewhat pared down. Cerny successfully battled to have the marble feature only a reflection of light that alludes to a smile, rather than a full face. There weren't a whole lot of arcade games like Marble Madness either before or after it. Those 6 levels, complete with music that's a bit more orchestral in feel and the MC Escher inspired aesthetic running through the whole thing, utterly stick out in the mind, and it's definitely one of the best trackball games of them all. By the standards of the time, it was also a very decent hit. Over 3,200 units were shipped, although Cerny did wish that he was able to make the game a little longer. In the end, Cerny leaves Atari a couple of years after this game, making his way to Sega. From there he founds the Sega Technical Institute, he works on various titles including Sonic 2, and starts working with Sony on the hardware side where he's a key part of the PS2, PS3 and PS4. It's a Hall of Fame career, of course, and Atari was where it all began. "1985 will see things change at Atari Games yet again, but we'll get to that in a bit. For now, let's keep the games going. The year starts in March with The Empire Strikes Back. It's the second Star Wars film, but it's the third Star Wars arcade game. This one was actually exclusively released as a conversion kit for the original Star Wars arcade, which means we're going back to the Vectors. This is the last Atari Vector game, and the only one released under the Atari Games banner. We have all new stages based off of the movie, although by far the best ones are the first 2, where you're in the snowspeeder on Hoth and you're initially taking on Probots before having to best the almighty AT-ATs, using the harpoons to tie up their legs and all of that. The second part of the game has you in the Millennium Falcon, where you take on TIE fighters and go through an asteroid belt, before you get a drawing of Darth Vader. Alas, you don't really get a climactic final battle with your dad here. The other main addition is the Jedi letters that you gain through hitting targets, which you can use to get a bit of invincibility. Which is fine, I guess. Empire is just okay, really. The gameplay loop just isn't at all as satisfying as the original game, or even the one from Jedi, but I guess that's the nature of this film, especially if there's no way to include a big lightsaber fight. This flick doesn't end with a massive explosion, after all. Take-up from operators for Empire was pretty low, and only a few hundred kits were sold. As it happens, the original Star Wars arcade was still performing pretty well, so most operators didn't really see the need to convert it.
General, prepare your troops for a surface attack.
Our first big game of 1985 then is Paperboy, one of the best arcade games you'll find that's based off of a thoroughly mundane profession. Our heroic bike rider delivers the daily sun in what should be a quiet, Leave It to Beaver-esque suburb, but it's one that turns out to be utterly fraught with hazards. Drunken men stumbling down the street, people fighting each other, cars backing out, little brats playing with their RC cars, the occasional tornado, perhaps even the Grim Reaper. It's all somewhat twisted and a little bit surreal, which is something a lot of people appreciated, although a few even more out there obstacles were removed near the end of development. The game was by Dave Ralston and John Sarwitz, who previously worked together on the cancelled AKR, and it takes advantage of more new hardware. John Snyder's System 2 board, which runs games in 520 by 384, or medium resolution. That certainly makes it look quite nice. Even with the amusing take on plain old paper delivery and the crisp graphics and all of that, the main pull is actually playing it. It's a beautiful title that combines the accuracy needed to quickly chuck a rag into the mailboxes of your subscribers, with the desire to then go all out smashing the windows and other assorted knickknacks of your non-subscribers' houses, which naturally results in points. Although obviously you don't want to throw too many papers willy-nilly, as you mustn't run out of them. The Paperboy must deliver. Otherwise he's going to end up getting the sack and the residents will say that he's the worst to ever do it and what have you. It's as brilliantly designed a game as it is funny, there's multiple ways to play it well, it's even got a ridiculously catchy earworm for music, and an all-timer cabinet complete with a handlebar yoke. Paperboy is a classic in every way, and it did very well. Nearly 3,500 units were shipped, and the game had quite a long life. Wonderful stuff.
Oh man, that's bogus.
I find July 1985's Peter Pack-Rat to be a rather odd game in many ways, although it is also a rather fun and kind of underrated one. A title that was mostly worked on in 1984 before being mysteriously held back until the summer of 85, Peter Pack-Rat features a titular rodent who loves to go around collecting trash, doing so over a few different stages, sliding down slopes, occasionally using birds to get to places quickly, and avoiding various kooky named enemies like Claude the Cat or Diamond Jim the Snake. Seemingly, it's also a game that was a bit more adult-themed at one stage. There's certain objects, such as packs of cigarettes or lighters, that were part of the collectible trash at one stage but were removed, although their outlines can still be seen. There is some sort of alternate universe in which Peter was a huge success and went on to be a star for Atari, perhaps featuring in his own Saturday morning cartoon, which wouldn't have been too out of place, seeing as the artist Debbie Hayes, she who was most responsible for the game's very pleasing presentation, was previously employed by the likes of Ralph Bakshi and Hanna-Barbera, and that really shows in this game. It's got a whole load of personality, everyone looks great, and it's actually quite fun to play too. In the end, Peter Pack-Rat wasn't a big success at all. There were around 150 cabinets and a few hundred conversion kits were sold, but I think it deserved a fair bit more than that. Maybe it would have got that if it came out a couple of years earlier, maybe not. Who knows? There's a couple of games here in the third video that I could have possibly started covering at the end of part 2 when I was talking about failed Laserdisc projects. However, I've left them until part 3 because, unlike the rest of them, these projects did end up coming out as games. The first of these is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which arrives in August. The partnership with Lucasfilm is still bearing fruit, as Indy's second adventure gets a banger of an arcade that's, well, it's certainly better than the old 2600 Raiders of the Lost Ark game, that's for sure. Originally, there were plans for this to be a Laserdisc title, one that would have centred around the film's big minecart chase. A cool idea, but according to designer Peter Lipson in Retro Gamer, it would have cost the earth. Shooting the amount of footage needed in said mines, the construction and so on, it would have been millions upon millions of dollars. The idea kinda sounds similar to the cancelled Playland game that we saw at the end of part 2, and it is easy to see why it failed to materialise. Instead, we get this action game, one that features, in the main, 3 separate stages. The main core of the game sees you explore the mines, rescuing children from the Fuggies and ripping the various cult members into shape. You can only stun them, although you may well end up sending them off the incredibly narrow paths as you hit them. Obviously you've got to be careful not to fall yourself, and you mustn't spend too much time in the mines. If you do, Mola Ram will attack you. You rescue the children, and then go on a brief but exciting minecart ride that's a little Return of the Jedi-esque, ripping the pursuing Fuggies? Tuggies? Anyway, occasionally trapping them with fire and so on. You get out, Indy, for it is he, actually voiced by Harrison Ford, says that we walk from here. We enter Mola Ram's lair and get the Sankara stone, which Indy's not leaving without. Only after doing this 3 times do you then get to a final stage where you cross the rope bridge and finally send Mola Ram down into the abyss for good. The gameplay loop is excellent. I mentioned Return of the Jedi, and Temple of Doom does in many ways feel like a better version of that title, one that's got a fair bit more going for it, with a lot more things added on as you go through the loops, much more in the way of new enemies, and a lot more variation in the levels. Temple of Doom did fine on the floor. Again, we've got a little under 3,000 in sales when you combine the number of cabinets made and conversion kits sold. It's another game I really enjoy.
Welcome. Welcome. I'll be back.
We've had a few games so far that have performed decently, but October 1985 sees Atari Games put out an absolute blockbuster. Kind of an important one, really. The sort of game that absolutely every operator wanted, something that'd bring customers right back to the arcade, a signifier that the big old crash has now largely passed, and even if business isn't what it was in the golden age, it's now healing. That game is Ed Logg's Gauntlet, and it's the biggest Atari coin-op in years. This big old 4-player cab shifted around 10,000 units, becoming a hit all around the world. Europe, Japan, they all loved Gauntlet. Operators loved it for rather obvious reasons, really. One cab can have as many as 4 players at once, all sticking in their money to play. So that's pretty damn good business. And of course players loved it because it's a big old dungeon, a relentless bashing of buttons as you take your warrior, wizard, Valkyrie or elf through hundreds of enemies, with a dungeon master tracking your process all the way, commenting on everything you do, and a thought that just maybe there's some sort of ending, some final level of the dungeon to be discovered. Which of course there isn't, at least not in the original arcade game at any rate. You can see why Gauntlet was such a money spinner back in 1985 and 86, but it's still an appealing title to play in so many ways. It has a lovely clean look about it, a difficulty that's challenging enough to make you want to explore further and stick more credits in, the satisfaction that comes with gradually making your character better through picking up hidden potions and making your way through the huge mobs of enemies. It is admittedly a bit of a coin muncher. Your health is forever dwindling, and fighting through those big mobs is a bit of a war of attrition at times. It's never really possible to get through ghosts or grunts or sorcerers and the like without taking a fair bit of damage, and the frenzied nature of the game means that it's easy to make mistakes, ones that you are naturally going to get scolded for. All of us have probably been told not to shoot the food at some point. Still, the original arcade acted as a base for so many excellent home versions, whether it's the NES game that changed things up considerably, microports that punched well above their weight, or the definitive Gauntlet IV on Mega Drive that came later, not to mention all the other dungeon crawlers that it influenced. Of course, Gauntlet itself was influenced a fair bit by other titles, indeed quite directly in some cases. While Dungeons & Dragons was a base influence for Gauntlet, it was called Dungeons for most of its development before someone thought that TSR might just sue over the name. There is one particular computer game that influenced it, that being Dandy, an Atari 8-bit 4-player dungeon crawler where you save keys to open doors, find potions, or bombs in this instance, that clear the screen, battle through monsters and destroy their spawn points. Dandy was a game that Ed Logg's son thoroughly enjoyed, and Logg freely admitted that Dandy was a very direct inspiration for Gauntlet. While Dandy's creator, John Palovich, was initially quite displeased about it, a dispute was settled out of court by Atari, both through Palovich receiving a Gauntlet cabinet of his own, and a later version of Dandy for the Atari 7800 called Dark Chambers that he was credited for. Still, Gauntlet goes down as a significant arcade classic. Dandy certainly had the potential to be a huge success on the floor, and Gauntlet made it so.
Oh! Ow!
Before we get into some unreleased titles, we have a bit more business to attend to. Warner's control of the coin-op division at Atari Games was ultimately short-lived. By the time we get to 1985, a whole lot more of Atari's various worldwide outposts were shut down, although some like the UK, Ireland and Taiwan still remain, and a deal is set up between Atari and Namco for the Japanese guys to take a controlling share in the company. Ultimately, this happens on February the 4th, with the incorporation of a new company called A.P.B Games. Basically, Atari Games is transferred to A.P.B Games, which then itself gets renamed to Atari Games, and Namco have a controlling share of 60%, with Warner retaining the other 40%. John Farrand naturally departs as CEO here, as Namco president Masaya Nakamura becomes chairman, and Hideyuki, or Hide Nakajima, becomes president. A little confusing, perhaps, but that's where we're at for the time being. Where Atari are at will also change. As 1985 reaches its end, their home base in the States moves from the original location in Sunnyvale to Milpitas. It's only 10 miles up the road, but it is the cutting of a big link back to the original company. Air Race is another attempt at an early 3D title. This one's on the same hardware as the cancelled Last Starfighter, and was worked on by several people who would later go on to build the hardware that powered Hard Drivin and S.T.U.N Runner, including Rick Moncrief and Jim Morris. We have a pretty early prototype to look at. It's a bit more playable than the Last Starfighter one, although it's obviously not yet at the stage where it's any kind of game and there's no sound. It doesn't seem that the game got too far. It ran on some pretty serious custom hardware for the time, and in the end it was deemed to be too expensive. However, quite a bit of the work that went into this project would then become the basis for Hard Drivin, including a polygon editor programmed by Jim Morris and a world editor by Max Behansky. A lot of the detail here comes from a Retro Gamer Making of Hard Drivin article by Rory Milne, and considering that Hard Drivin didn't come out until 1989, something like this little project shows just how long that game took to make. I briefly mentioned the isometric game based on Gremlins in the first video, and now would be a good time to have a closer look at it. This project was taken on by Franz Lanzinger, designer of the almighty Crystal Castles, and it would have been a System 2 game. You play as Billy, and from the looks of things there's several different types of level, parts where you're walking around and shining a flashlight on the pesky creatures, another part where Gizmo's driving a toy car, and so on. I should mention that I was perhaps inaccurate about this project's relation to the cancelled E.T. in the previous vid. As the excellent Game in Hell mentioned in the comments, there isn't actually much to support that beyond an old post on Atari Age, and no real connection between the two games to be found in design documents. The whole thing was eventually cancelled in 1985 after it was put in front of a focus group. After this, it was deemed that the Gremlins property and the game itself were not strong enough to warrant the time and resources necessary to complete it. A shame, really. From the gameplay footage out there, it looks like it may well have been entertaining, and there's just not enough available code kicking around right now, so it's not going to be available on MAME anytime soon, I would imagine. Since the video about unreleased Atari arcades, there's been big movement on a couple of games in particular, titles where we've gone from having almost nothing to something that's actually playable. And here's the first of those, 1985's Jammin. Previously, very little was known about this. We had a very old and low quality video of a rhythm game, a Simon-esque title where you're shown what to play and then you have to try and recreate that in time with the music. And well, that was it. All anyone knew is that it may possibly have still existed in somebody's private collection. That is, that's all we knew until December 2025. A user on the Arcade Museum forums named Dutchman2000 found some goodies on an old VAX backup tape, and the Jammin prototype is one of those. He released the source code on the forums. It's not complete, but there's a lot here. Enough for the game to be packed up and made playable on MAME. It's a shame that it didn't get released, to be honest. Jammin is actually quite good. The aim of the game is simple enough. You've got to get on that beat, and it's pretty fine and accurate in that department. You know, you play to time and whatever. Pairing this with the old video, you see how this would have worked. There's a control panel with 9 buttons in the formation of a drum kit, with the snare and toms all having 2 buttons assigned to them, one for each hand, and then the central kick drum button. I suppose the big thing that's really missing here are some cymbals, although perhaps those would have been added in. You have to match 4 beats per level, and you have to reach a target score in order to keep going. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at this, as it's kind of tricky to find space for so many buttons on a standard Xbox gamepad, like what I've got, and for it to make sense. But, I don't know, while Jammin didn't make the grade, I can certainly see it having legs on the floor, even if it is still a long while before rhythm games would make their huge mark in the arcade. A game that is way ahead of its time in a sense, perhaps even too far ahead. You can play this on the latest versions of MAME, and you absolutely should. We start 1986 by kicking it old school. It's 10 years since Atari, back when some of their games were released under the Key banner, scored a big hit with the original Sprint 2, itself a successor to the TTL-based Grand Track series. And now, it's back in a new and improved form. This is Super Sprint from April, with Robert Weatherby and Kelly Turner in charge of updating this old classic. The core principle of the game hasn't changed. You've got a car, and you're racing 3 others, including up to 2 other humans and the computer, over several single-screen tracks. That original gameplay was already utterly fine, so it didn't need a whole lot of changing. The main new thing, aside from the obvious graphics, is the ability to upgrade your car between tracks. You pick up wrenches during the race, and you can then use those to beef up your engine, your tyres, and so on. There's also a few more obstacles on the track, although some of them may provide an opportunity. While you obviously want to avoid things like oil slicks, and there's other little things like the odd jump, ramp and bridge that weren't there back in the 70s, the gates on most of the tracks could become a neat shortcut if you have the cojones to zip through them, and you're willing to risk that gate shutting on you. If you do blow yourself up, a chopper will quickly come to replace your vehicle, and you can upgrade this too. This revival of Sprint did pretty well. Class is thoroughly permanent, and Super Sprint was a fine hit on the floor, with around a couple of thousand units. Not bad considering that these are 3-player machines. Atari quickly followed this up with Championship Sprint in September, which we may as well cover now. The main difference between this and Super Sprint is that we've got different tracks to play around with, and this was also pitched as something of a cheaper option. Championship Sprint comes in a more standard cabinet with 2 players as opposed to 3. As such, this actually sold a few more units than Super Sprint, a little over 2,500 dedicated cabinets and just under 1,000 conversion kits. If you're going to play and enjoy one of these games, then you may as well play them both. They're fine updates on an age-old formula. Up next, we have the second game that was, at one stage, set to be a Laserdisc release, although this one, unlike Temple of Doom, ended up being released in a form that was closer to the original design. This is Roadrunner, which finally came out in July of '86 after a couple of years in development. The core gameplay for the original Laserdisc version, which was started in 1984, and what eventually came out, is pretty much identical. It's side-scrolling action where Fastius Tastius, our heroic Roadrunner, picks up all the seeds, and Carnivorous Vulgarius, Wile E. Coyote, chases him and tries to deploy all his tricks in order to finally get his long sought after avian lunch. Roadrunner does have to pick up these seeds, even if they may put him in trouble. If you miss too many seeds, then he'll slow down and be easy prey for the fiendish coyote. While the graphics in the released version are very well done and authentic to the classic cartoon, the original would have background graphics that were played from the Laserdisc with the gameplay overlaid on top, thus being even more authentic. And there would have been cutscenes from the cartoon whenever you or Wile's efforts were foiled by, say, Wile being lured into some sort of trap, falling off a cliff and so on. The end of the Laserdisc boom put paid to the whole idea, as Atari no longer considered it viable due to the costs, the reliability and so on. Although the prototype of the Laserdisc version does exist, and as with a bunch of other unreleased Atari stuff, it's been shown off at the California Extreme Expo. As for the released game, it did okay. Once again, it fared better as a conversion kit as opposed to a dedicated cabinet, seeing as that was a cheaper option and it was easy enough to convert one Atari System 1 game to another. Quality-wise, it's fine. Definitely not my favourite Atari coin-op by any stretch, but it's a very good-looking title. Nearly a year after their big success with the original, Atari released Gauntlet II in August of 1986, although once again this is primarily sold as a conversion kit for existing Gauntlet cabs as opposed to being a whole new machine. Ed Logg is still in charge, and the core formula very much remains. We're still trying to find that exit, possibly using magic, perhaps even finding a warp, hopefully not taking too much damage or running out of keys so that you have to wait for the doors to unlock, and so forth. There's various additions in the enemies department, with the whole new dragon particularly standing out, and there's also new tiles and walls, invisible dungeons, tiles that stun the player, and so on. All of this is fine, but the biggest addition in Gauntlet 2 is undoubtedly the one that was most requested. The 4 players now have a colour assigned to them, as opposed to specifically controlling one of the heroes, meaning that 4 players can now all pick whatever hero they want. You can, if you so desire, have 4 Fours, 2 Merlins and 2 Tyras, a speedy quartet of Questors and so on. It all makes for a big slice of new Gauntlet action, and the take-up for Gauntlet 2 was pretty good. A little over 3,000 conversion kits were made. It's a fine thing if you've exhausted the original and you're looking for a new challenge.
Red Elf, your life force is running out.
Our last released game from 1986 is something that's very different. It's the first ever skateboarding game. 720 Degrees from December is another game from the almighty Ralston and Sarwitz duo, although the original idea actually came from a technician named Rob Rowe, who was a skater. Apparently, while people initially laughed, they soon started to take the idea quite seriously, eventually to a point where Atari went all out to create a skateboarding game that wasn't just good, but also had an authentic feel about it. They even built a half-pipe in a warehouse and invited top skaters to use it so that they could record their moves. The finished game features branding from California's own Sessions shop, and the thoroughly bodacious cabinet is very much designed with skater aesthetics in mind, as well as a joystick with a rotary dial that's key to performing tricks. In the end, they did a pretty good job, making around 2,200 cabinets. Not bad for something so unique at the time. 720 is also a bit of an open world as far as the game goes. You ride around Skate City, with the goal being to place or win 4 events located in each corner: the downhill, ramp, slalom and jump. You get tickets for these events by scoring points, which you do both by doing well in those events, but also by doing plenty of tricks out in the open area, and you also get cash which you can use to upgrade your equipment. The key is that you can't spend too long dawdling and failing to get the points you need. There is a timer, and once it hits 0 you will be commanded to skate or die, at which point a swarm of bees will come at you, and if they hit you before you get to a park, then the game's over. It makes for quite a cool game to screw around in, one where you can have fun either simply messing about, or through actually trying to get some decent lines going. It's not that dissimilar from the sort of extreme sports games that would do gangbusters in the late 90s, the Tony Hawks and the like. Really good.
You got to have a ticket, skate or die.
We only have one unreleased game from 1986, but it's another brand new discovery. And here there was even less to show previously than there was for Jammin. You may already know of an Atari arcade game called Relief Pitcher from 1992. We'll be covering this one in the last part, and it's largely a standard baseball game. But it wasn't the first title with this name. Relief Pitcher dates all the way back to 1986, and it would originally have been a System 1 title. Now, I unfortunately missed this one in the original unreleased games vid, although really there was only ever a couple of photos to go on here, available on the Atari Compendium. Again, there was very little to say. And then, once again, Dutchman 2000 slides in hot, hits the home run, scores the triple play, and so many other metaphors. Suddenly, in December 2025, we've secured a prototype of the original Relief Pitcher, found on an old VAX backup tape. What glorious preservation! And again, we can now play this title in MAME. This one's a bit less complete than Jammin. You can tell that it needs a fair bit of graphical cleanup, but it has a little twist on the usual baseball formula. As the title suggests, you play as a relief pitcher who comes in late in the game with the scores still tight and tries to help secure the victory. It's the top of the 9th, the scores are tied and so on. And so you pitch and try to retire the batting side as quickly as possible. You've got to make sure to mix the pitchers up, be good on the field and so on. If you do happen to concede some runs and the scores are tied or you're behind, it's not yet over. You can then bat in the bottom of the 9th and try to win the game that way. This twist is actually quite cool. It avoids the usual issue of a baseball game in the arcade, in that who the hell's going to pump enough coins in to get through a whole bloody match? It's not long here before you actually get a frickin' result, and I like that. There's also lots of synth speech commentary and some little speech bubbles from the team, including some that I'm guessing wouldn't have made it into a finished game. I'm not sure that "I'm pissed" would have gone down well with some more straight-laced folks. Anyway, I think this is totally fine, especially as far as baseball games go. It's more my cup of tea than they usually are, and it's worth a little look in the latest versions of MAME.
Oh, what a hit! It's off the wall! Fires to the plate. Single, 1 out.
How's about kicking 1987 off with a death-fueled rally chock full of guns and explosions? March sees the release of RoadBlasters, a really superb game that I feel is actually a little underrated. Originally named Future Vet in its write-up by Lyle Rains, RoadBlasters isn't quite as graphically impressive as other racing games that were kicking around at this time, seeing as it's still using the System 1 board, indeed this is the last game to use it, but it makes up for it with action, being able to shoot down the other cars, bikes and the like on the track while also getting fuel pickups, as well as the odd power-up that's delivered to you via airdrop. The key to RoadBlasters that makes it a little bit more than a kind of mindless point A to point B shooter is engaging with the score multiplier and not simply bashing the shoot button. You increase the multiplier through being accurate, picking out your shots and not missing them. If you miss or crash, the multiplier decreases, so you score through both sharpshooting and good driving, and it's incredibly satisfying if you get it right. One other cool feature at the time is the presence of a competition, which gets detailed in the Attract mode. If you managed to complete all of the game's 50 levels, you would get a code that you could send off for a t-shirt. Very cool stuff, really. It isn't Outrun, but it's not trying to be that sort of thing. It's a bit cruder, a bit more violent, and lots of fun. July's A.P.B, All Points Bulletin, marks the first time for a while that we have seen the almighty Dave Turer. He's very much still about, and he's spent a lot of time working on this game, or rather he's been working on a huge world building tool that this game was created from. Indeed, 2.5 years were spent creating such a tool, complete with a huge amount of assets. One that would help to make a driving game that, while it was inspired by Spy Hunter, would hopefully feel like it actually took place in a living world, as opposed to simply some rather plain areas where the roads filled with enemies. So yeah, a lot more thought and detail went into this game than you may perhaps think went into it. You play as Officer Bob, and your mission is to catch various ne'er-do-wells in the act of criminality. These villains could just be simple litterbugs, or they could be wanted fugitives. Rather than simply blasting them, perhaps a bit too extreme of an approach for someone who's driving drunk or whatever, you use your siren to make them pull over, or you ram their car if they don't comply. You're going to need to do this with the fugitives. Each stage takes place over a day. You're pretty free to roam the streets in search of the bad guys while also occasionally stopping off for fuel and donuts. You've got to meet a quota of tickets and arrests, and you mustn't get too many demerits. You get these for crashing, pulling over the wrong people and so on, and you'll be fired if you get too many. You even get a little minigame when you arrest a serious felon in which you shake them down for info before the chief comes in. A cool little touch. The gameplay is totally fine, but it's in the world where A.P.B most definitely shines. An absolutely stunning top-down game filled with details, a huge town that feels explorable, complete with several thoroughly distinct neighbourhoods. Really, it's a lot more ambitious than most perhaps realise. In some ways it may be considered a bit of a failure, mainly because it seems as though the world-building tool that Dave Turer spent so much time creating was only ever used on this game, which ended up shifting around 2,000 units, and it did end up being Turer's final released Atari title. Still, it's pretty great, very engrossing to play, filled with life, and really quite funny.
Sure thing, officer. Move over, buddy.
It's November 1987, and we've got another somewhat different sort of game. It's a shooter, but one that's got a third dimension about it. It's Xybots. This is another game by the great Ed Logg, and according to his interview from the book Game Design Theory and Practice, it came from a challenge that was set to him by Doug Snyder. Make an arcade game that had similar mechanics to the PC title Castle Wolfenstein, only in 3D and without any specialised hardware. And that's basically what Logg ended up doing. It was at first envisioned as a 3D sequel to Gauntlet called Catacombs, but this was rejected and Logg went for a sci-fi theme instead that they, him and Bob Flanagan, the lead programmer, thought of as a spiritual successor to Major Havoc. You play as either Major Rock Hardy or Captain Ace Gunn, and you're looking for the elevator in each maze. Much like Gauntlet, your health's always going down, you'll have to find keys, and there may be the odd hidden passage behind a fake wall. The action is much more deliberate here, kind of like an updated Berserk. You fight robots on a more even keel, strafing and taking 90-degree turns, and there's even the odd bit of cover here and there from their shots. It is much more like a shootout, especially when you get to the bots that have their own shields. You can upgrade between each level using pods that you've picked up, getting better shots, speed and the like, although as things get tougher it may simply be a case of using those credits to get a bit more health. This is a really good game. Again, there's not much like Xybots kicking around in the arcade at the time, which helps a lot. Also, I must say that this has one of my absolute favourite cabinets. It looks kind of like a robot from the game, and it has a joystick that's similar to the one from 720, in that you move it, but also use the rotary dial to make turns. It's not entirely without issue. There is an awful lot of information on the screen with the map, your status and so on, meaning that the actual gameplay area is quite small. Log thought in retrospect that it was too small, and that hurt the game somewhat. Xybots was an okay enough performer, with around 1,750 units made, but still, it definitely deserved more than that. It's a fabulous game that is ahead of its time. With the status of Atari Games about to change again, now's a good time to quickly look at the games that they published in this period. As you might expect, all of them are by Namco, and they include some pretty successful games. Rollin' Thunder was certainly a strong performer, with around 2,400 units sold in the States, making it by far the most successful published Atari effort from this period, more so even than Pac-Mania, for which Atari produced a little over 1,400 cabs. Final Lap also did very well, considering that's a bit more of an expensive cab. We've got a little over 1,100 cabs there if you combine stats for both the standard machine and the cheaper upright, and we've also got a little over 1,000 for Assault. Finally, Dragon Spirit and Galaga 88 are a little more modest, with cab stats of 600 and 986 respectively, most of Galaga's being conversion kits. Still, these are all very high quality games, all hugely worth playing. If you wish to know more about these games, they're all in my series of videos about Namco. On the other side of things, a couple of Atari NES games did appear on Nintendo's Arcade Versus system, games that were originally released through Tengen, the company's new label for console titles that was set up in 1987. One is Atari RBI Baseball, which is basically a localised version of Namco's Pro Yakyu Family Stadium. The other, more interestingly, is Tetris. Interesting considering that this NES version was eventually pulled from the console following the conclusion of the legal battle between Nintendo and Atari over the game. Still, that largely had to do with the rights to make a Tetris game for consoles. The rights to release an arcade game based on Tetris in the States were more definitively Atari's, and so it's the Tengen version of Tetris that appears on the Versus system, as opposed to Nintendo's one. So, we start off 1988 by going back to the business side of things, because once again, it's all changed over at Atari Towers. There's a new master, and, well actually, that master is basically Atari themselves. Namco made a decision that they no longer wished to be in control of Atari Games, viewing them more as a direct competitor and rival, and wanting to get more of their own foothold in the West. And so they decided to sell a third of their shares to Atari Games themselves, meaning that while both Namco and Warner had 40% of the shares, Atari themselves had 20%. Seeing as no company had a controlling share, and Namco and Warner weren't exactly engaging with each other really, this means that Atari Games is pretty much independent now. Or at least they're the most independent they've been since before the deal Nolan Bushnell made with Warner all the way back in 1976. Masaya Nakamura remains the chairman of Atari Games until June of '88, but then resigns from the board, leaving Hideyuki Nakajima, who also resigns from Namco America around this time, indisputably in charge, while a fair few other executives are people who have been part of Atari for quite some time. folks like Lyle Waynes, Dan Van Elderen and Mary Fujihara. Relations certainly aren't fully broken between Atari Games and Namco, with Atari Games still distributing a couple more of Namco's arcade releases. While Splatterhouse did have very little presence in Western arcades due to its rather bloody nature, Atari Games did distribute it, making around 100 PCBs, and they also distribute 4 tracks at the end of the 1980s. That would be the last of the Namco coin-ops distributed for Atari, as further changes in 1990 meant that Namco would start publishing their games internationally by themselves, as opposed to through other companies. With all that business cleared up, we're going back to games for the rest of the video. The first half of 1988 sees Atari once again feeling a little bit nostalgic, thinking that it's time to bring back an old arcade legend. And so, from February 1988, we've got Blasteroids, the first new Asteroids game since 1982's Space Duel. It's also the first time we've heard the name Ed Rotberg in a while. The man behind Battlezone left Atari in 1981 to co-found Videa alongside Wendy Allen and Roger Hector, which then became Senti when Nolan Bushnell acquired it and brought it into the Pizza Time Theatre empire. That lasted mere months. When Pizza Time Theatre filed for bankruptcy in 1984, Senti was acquired again, this time by Bally, but 1988 saw it finally get closed up for good. It's a complex history, one perhaps worthy of its own video, but Ed Rotberg came back to Atari in '87 for a couple more games that we're covering in this part. Blasteroids obviously dispenses of the long-gone vectors of the original, actually using digitised sprites for its ships and a rotary knob to twirl the ship around, and on the whole, it evolves Asteroids play quite nicely. You have to travel through several zones, clearing them all out of space rocks and dealing with enemy ships before you face the almighty Mukor. You can get a couple of power-ups such as Twin Blasters and Rip Stars, you've got to be mindful of fuel, and crucially you can automatically transform into one of 3 ships, a speeder, fighter and warrior. If you've got 2 players, you can also do the space duel thing of docking 2 ships together for double the firepower, and you're probably going to want some of the biggest weapons for the Mukor, who is pretty damn tough. Hopefully you've got enough Rip Stars. I would say it's Asteroids but with a little shake of Sinistar, plus some nice orchestral music. It's a very good update, and one that influenced a few little things itself. The much loved Stardust games, for example, while often called a take on Asteroids, are perhaps more accurately described as a take on Blasteroids. They've both got the zones and that. Of course, this was never going to be as successful as the original. The arcade is, in 1988, a totally different place to where it was in '79, but there were 2,000 Blasteroids cabs produced, which isn't bad at all. April's Vindicators is, in a sense, also a game that's taken inspiration from Atari's past. Designed by Kelly Turner, it's the first tank-type game that Atari have produced in a while. The controls may well remind you of Battlezone, but there is a line here that goes all the way back to Steve Bristow's original Tank from 1974. Much like Tank, this is a top-down game, although obviously a bit more complex. You're controlling a futuristic tank through the enemy's space station, trying to find the base, blasting your way through areas, dueling with rival tanks. It kind of feels like a sister title to Xybots in many ways. The aesthetics are similar, you once again have the ability to upgrade your player between levels, and the cabinets are also kinda similar, although Vindicators is quite a bit heavier. I like how in the old arcade museum descriptions, it's described as both looking like a tank and weighing like one. The controls are also really quite complex, definitely something you need a couple of goes to get used to, especially seeing as not all of the controls are available immediately. You have the 2 levers to move and turn the tank in the classic style, but there's also buttons that you use to turn the turret. You can strafe. However, you actually have to buy this ability in order to use it. There's a definite challenge here, one that may not be immediately satisfying, but it does feel great once you get to grips with it. Still, that lack of immediacy probably didn't help it set the arcade on fire. There were a little over 1600 Vindicator cabs, which isn't too bad, and it's definitely a game that's worth looking at, so long as you can get the controls right. I should also quickly mention the update that Atari released for the game here. You could buy Vindicators Part 2 as a conversion kit, released in May of 1989. Now, having said that, it is hard to really call this an update. In fact, while some weapons are changed a bit, the game has actually been stripped down a little to turn it into a conversion kit, with a few of the levels removed, as well as the more obvious removal of a t-shirt competition that was included in the original, a la RoadBlasters. Vindicators Part 2 was sold as a conversion kit for Gauntlet, which, I don't know, that seems like quite a lot of work, and perhaps not hugely advisable for an operator considering the popularity of Gauntlet, even several years after its original release. Only 400 of these kits were made, and it's a pretty obscure release. Honestly, it's not difficult to see why this kit's relatively unknown. We've had quite a few sci-fi and shooty games lately, so it's nice to have something a little different once again. Here's Toobin from June of 1988. We've got the nice and crisp medium resolution System 2 graphics for the last time, and we've got a game based on Inner Toobin, where the ultra cool Biff and Jet make their way down the rapids, going through various areas, getting through the gates, avoiding all sorts of strange obstacles, occasionally hitting them or each other with Coke cans. It's very bright and very damn good. The game's by Dennis Harper, and he was partnered here by someone who's a bit of an unsung legend for the company, Milt Loper, who created several of Atari's best looking cabinets, including the likes of Paperboy and 720. Not only did he do the lovely cab for this one, he also worked extensively on designing the game. Initially something based around kayaking with tank-esque controls for rowing the boat, the game wasn't actually all that fun in this form, and so Harper took a bit of inspiration from track and field. Toobin is entirely based around using buttons. You have 4 buttons to control your tuber's arms and legs, tapping them not just to be quick, but to guide Biff or Jet around the various tricks and traps. It's certainly not mindless, and it quickly feels like second nature. Paired up with the game getting quite surreal as it goes on, honestly this one is an absolute gem. I reckon this is Atari's best coin-op since Gauntlet. Toobin sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap, which is unfortunate, and I think entirely down to bad home versions of the game. You simply couldn't emulate the controls of the arcade on consoles and computers of the time because there weren't enough buttons available to pull it off, and a joystick simply isn't the same. In the arcade, this is glorious, and I can find almost nothing to fault about it. It had about 1,500 cabs made, which is getting to be a fairly standard number for Atari's arcade games as we get closer to the end of the 1980s. Finally, in 1988, we've got Cyberball. It's football in the 21st century. How quaint. While we still don't have robots on the field, or balls that explode in gridiron these days, Cyberball tries its best to give us a futuristic take on American football. This is another title from Dave Ralston and John Sarwitz, and the football itself is appropriately speedy and suitable for the arcade. You get 4 plays to choose from for every snap, whether you're on offence or defence. They're pretty clear and easy to follow, and crucially it's a nice big cabinet with 2 monitors. After all, you don't want your opponent to see the plays that you pick. There's no wild changes to the football formula, really. The ball warms up with each play, and you have to reach the call-in line, which is basically the first down line. If you don't reach it in 5 plays, the ball explodes and it turns over to the opposition. If you score a touchdown, then you get 2 options: pass the ball into the end zone for 1 point, or run it in for 2. No field goals and no punts. The football itself is fine, and yet I do think Cyberball is a little bit of a missed opportunity. I do wish it leaned a bit further into being futuristic, had a bit more in the way of gimmicks about it, using blasters or jumping 200 feet in the air to receive a pass. Really, robots aside, this does play like a pretty standard game of football. You can use a turbo boost once in each play, but I kinda want more. There's another mechanic here where robots can be damaged and they can fumble the ball over time, meaning that you need money to repair and upgrade them, but I do think Cyberball, while perfectly good, does stick a bit too close to the original game. We actually have two updates for this game, and we may as well cover them both now. Cyberball 2072 and Tournament Cyberball 2072, released in August and October of 1989 respectively, fit two separate niches. The tournament game is the actual major update. You get a whole bunch more plays, a couple of new players, a rookie mode for those getting used to the action, and so on. If you like Cyberball, then this is the ideal version of it. The regular Cyberball 2072 is a more standard conversion kit, one that can be used in any jammer cabinet, as is the standard now by the time we get to the late 80s. It's a two-player upright. Obviously this means there's only one monitor and the opponent's going to see what the player's picking, but it's a cheaper option. I'm not a huge Cyberball fan, but I can't argue with success. The original shifted around 1,250 units, the two updates probably added a few hundred more onto that, and these are mostly 4-player cabs, a game where 2 teams of 2 can go at each other. So yeah, it was definitely a hit. Accelerator is another game for which not a whole lot is known, although you may possibly be able to play it if you're ever at the California Extreme Expo. It has been there, along with a few titles that were mentioned in the first vid. Gameplay footage is available, and it's an odd-looking title. Made by Dennis Harper and Rusty Door, this is a side-on futuristic racing game of sorts, controlled with a spinner that moves the vehicle on a big tube. There's various special pads on the tube that you'll either want to touch or avoid, along with enemies called sluggos that should also be avoided, shot or sliced, and the screen's divided in half. It's certainly a game meant for 2 players. It looks a bit like a cousin of S.T.U.N, only obviously not in 3D, although the first game it actually reminds me of is Uniracers, or Unirally, which came out for the SNES a good few years later. This game didn't make it because, altogether now, it didn't test very well out in the field. As we've gone through the years, looking at these various Atari games, a whole other team has been working on a rather ambitious project. They've been making the company's 3D hardware. This team was known as the Applied Research Division. It was led by a game designer named Rick Moncrief, and it included a fair few people who have been part of Atari for some time and worked on several of their most ambitious titles. People like Jed Margolin on hardware design, Max Behensky on software, and technician Eric Durfee, as well as game programmer Stephanie Mott. That's the core team, although plenty other folks worked on the project, including other serious veterans like Mike Albor and Ed Rotberg. Initially, the main aim of it all was to create a serious driving simulator. Not necessarily a pure game, but something that could have various users, perhaps as a training tool that would be used by driving schools. But of course, this work would all eventually go into a game, and it would be a damn good one. February 1989 sees the release of the groundbreaking Hard Drivin, coming out only a couple of months after Namco's own 3D racing effort, Winning One, although Hard Drivin came out first in the West. Indeed, Atari and Namco had actually worked together on the 3D hardware until they decided to break off from each other. Hard Drivin tries its best to be as accurate a driving sim as you can possibly get for the time, and it doesn't do a bad job at all. The polygon graphics may not have aged well and all of that, but you get a course with 2 different and memorable tracks, one for speed and one for stunts. You go through them and try to set a time that's going to qualify you for the championship lap against the Phantom Photon, essentially a ghost driver who is racing the stand-in fastest lap. The care and effort went so far as to enlist the services of one Doug Milliken in the creation of the game, an expert in car modelling who was credited as one of the game's test drivers. Atari and Doug were purposefully coy about exactly what he did, and just how important he was to the game. This is one of those games where it is both fun to play well and also fun to play badly. There's equal joy in both getting a nice smooth line, hitting the apex and all that, as well as having a whopper of a crash, sending your car flying off the loop-de-loop or whatever, especially because you get a nice instant replay of what you did, complete with explosion and smashed windscreen. All this work, complete with an appropriate and excellent environmental cabinet, thoroughly paid off. The game was hugely acclaimed, majorly influential, and successful. There were nearly 2,000 hard driving units made, which is pretty good considering that they were priced at nearly $8,000 a piece. It was, at the time, the closest the arcade got to the real thing, and actually having the feeling that you were driving a proper sports car. Tetris was, of course, a bit of a bone in Atari's side. The NES version of the game was, after all, the subject of a long and ultimately costly legal battle between Atari and Nintendo, one in which Atari would ultimately come out on the losing side. As mentioned previously, the arcade rights are a bit more clear-cut. Atari most definitely had the rights to produce a version of the Soviet mega-hit for North America, while Sega obtained the rights to produce an arcade version for Japan. This arcade version, largely the work of Norm Avalar and Kelly Turner, came out in February of 1989 and, well, it's a pretty good version of Tetris. This version isn't merely about the regular marathon where you get an empty well, filling it up and making lines until you run out of space. You do actually have levels here, in which you have to meet a quota of lines before moving on to the next, where the play doesn't just get faster, but the well starts with more uneven blocks that you have to contend with. You can have two players going at it simultaneously as well, competing against each other. This is the first Tetris to feature a multiplayer option, which is nice. Unsurprisingly, Tetris did do pretty well in the arcade. It's already one of the most famous games in the world by this point, so it didn't exactly have too much trouble attracting customers. And it definitely does the game justice. It's July, and we've got another pretty excellent game. Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, a B-movie-inspired isometric shooter from Mark Pierce and Bonnie Smithson. Can Jake and Link rescue Dr. Sarah Bellum from her lab that's now filled with evil reptilons? Well, obviously that depends on you. There's a fair bit of Gauntlet going on here, but the campness of this title means that Robot Monsters is thoroughly its own beast, one where you need to go through each area, flicking the switch that makes the escalator work, rescuing technicians and having a whole lot of fights. It is kind of like Xybots in that you do have a few options here, often having the ability to duck under cover and often needing to duck in order to take out certain enemies, as well as jumping over the odd trap. You also get a Return of the Jedi-esque sequence in which you ride your spaceship through a maze, and then after that you get a fight against a big boss creature, in which the bombs that you pick up do tend to come in pretty handy. It does seem as though Atari's arcades are becoming less fashionable as we get to the end of the 1980s, and Robot Monsters was another pretty mediocre performer with around about 1,000 conversion kits made. But it is definitely a quality product, and the fun presentation really goes a long way to making it a joy to play. Having spent so long making that 3D hardware, it's not too long before Atari releases a second game that uses it, and it's even better than the first one. September's Stun Runner is a much quicker and much more arcadey affair. You absolutely tear through a bunch of tracks that largely consist of either flat surfaces or tunnels that you can roll in, staying to the fastest route as much as possible, picking up stars, hitting boosts, shooting other vehicles, and occasionally using shockwaves to take out ones that can't simply be blasted. This is a game that, technically, goes back a very long way. Ed Rotberg designed this game based on an idea by Carol Cameron, but it's pretty similar to the Tube Chase game that Owen Rubin worked on a decade previously, the one that eventually came out as Tunnel Hunt, although obviously the hardware here is way more powerful. Rubin and Rotberg were great friends, and Rubin would often say to Rotberg that he'd created the ideal vision that he had for his old game. While this uses the same flat-shaded polygons that you'd find in Hard Drivin, the look of Stun Runner has definitely held up better. It's a much more forgiving game to get to grips with, the cabinet's another gem, and just like Hard Drivin, it sold quite well despite being pretty damn expensive. When it comes to older 3D arcades that are still very much worth playing now, Stun Runner is one that's right up there. The fact that it's shockingly over 35 years old really doesn't matter a jot, frankly. One of the best games in this whole video, and a good way for Ed Rotberg to sign off. He leaves gaming not long after Stun Runner to join up with his old friend Owen Rubin at Apple. We do have one final playable unreleased game to look at before the video ends, but here's the last coin-op that Atari released in the 1980s, Skull and Crossbones, a game by Bob Flanagan and Mike Halley. While the last title featured Atari on the bleeding edge of innovation, this one is more a case of Atari trying to follow in others' footsteps. It's their belated entry into the belt-scrolling genre, although it's more hack and slash than beat 'em up, one where our pirate heroes One Eye and Red Dog pursue a wizard, dig for booty and other assorted plunder, and duel it out with all sorts of other seafarers, not to mention ninjas and the like, as their parrot constantly and rather irritatingly comments on the action. He's not quite at Cedric Liao's level, but he might set your teeth grinding a bit. If you're looking for a direct rival to this game, you would find it in Sega's Golden Axe, and, well, that is not a comparison that will do Skull and Crossbones any favours. Sega's game effortlessly rips this to shreds in every department. On its own merits, this is a pretty middling title on the gameplay front, although the cartoony presentation does give it a little bit of charm. It is at least different in that department to the other major beat-em-ups that are now on the arcade floor and beginning to dominate. Still, it's not exactly a game that's riding the zeitgeist when it comes to its premise and setting. Skull and Crossbones was ultimately a bit of a flop, with only around 850 conversion kits and less than 100 dedicated cabs, and it's kind of easy to see why. I do admittedly get a little kick out of it, even if I'm utterly aware that it's not a particularly good game. Perhaps there's something a little nostalgic, something fun about doing the odd stunt that keeps me playing it for a bit, even if it's largely a mindless chore that's doing little except gulping down credits like so much foul-smelling grog. Still, it's definitely one of this part's weakest titles. It's nice when we've got an unreleased game that we can actually play on MAME, and here's one of those, Guts and Glory from 1989. This is one of the best unreleased Atari games, and it's certainly one with a high pedigree considering that both Ed Logg and Dave Tura worked on programming it, so basically an Atari arcade dream team. More pedigree comes from the game essentially being an updated version of one of the company's best known titles, 1977's Combat, the game that was packed in with 2600s for years. It's made for two players to compete with each other, shooting down as many enemies as possible in various different modes. There's anti-aircraft, depth charge, submarine, bombing, machine gun, as well as a ground assault mode that wasn't yet playable at the time of this particular version. You blast everything in sight, try not to get killed yourself, and meet the quota within the time limit. Simple stuff, but executed very well, and it's a shame that it never came out. I expect that it didn't make it due to the usual reason, although there's no concrete info available here. Maybe the arcade goers just weren't that keen on this new take on old concepts in 1989, considering other games that were available. I mean, admittedly you probably wouldn't go for the shooting in this game over the likes of Operation Wolf, for example. But it's a cool collection of old school combat games nonetheless. And that does it for this third part. The 80s are finally in the books, and we should just have one more part to go. As we head into the 90s, the arcades are going to become very popular indeed once again, and we'll see how Atari Games responds to that. There will be more good titles, some that are perhaps a bit lacking, a whole bunch more unreleased ones. It'll be fun. Do join me for that fourth part, but hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.